2011, a series of protests shook the Near East and the Arab world. These uprisings, which would come to be known as the Arab Spring, soon devolved into civil war in many of the countries where they took place. Case in point is the country of Syria, which has had a civil war raging from that time until the present day. Recently, however, a ceasefire has been arranged trilaterally between the Syrian government, the nation of Turkey, and the nation of Russia. Outside observers have been wondering if this ceasefire means that the civil war in Syria is on a path towards a peaceful end. And thus, the question must be posed. Does the current ceasefire between Turkey, Syria, and Russia in Syria mean that Syria is on its way towards peace? And the answer, as we shall see today, to this question is an unfortunate one. And we can see why this is the case for three simple reasons. First, the ceasefire does not allow for outside observers to limit the number of war crimes being committed. Next, the Syrian government does not intend for needed resources to be allowed into the country. And finally, the so-called ceasefire does not actually cease hostilities against many of the key players. By looking at all of this, we can see exactly why the current ceasefire on the ground in Syria is in fact in large part a farce. The war in Syria has been noted for war crimes committed in large part by all parties in the conflict, rebels and government alike. But as The Economist has noted, on the 7th of January 2017, the current ceasefire, as it is currently constructed between the three parties, is unique in that it does not allow for international observers to hold the ceasefire in place. The article notes that no outside observers, such as the EU, UN, or Arab League, are involved, and thus no international forces are there to make sure that none of the parties involved continue to commit war crimes in areas that they occupy. Thus, as according to a Business Insider article from the 15th of January, this means that in areas occupied by various rebel groups or by the Syrian government, they can continue to commit atrocities such as torture, rape, or even murder of civilians as much as they wish, because no one is there to check them on their actions. This means, unfortunately for civilians on the ground, they will have to continue to endure the torment that they have for the past several years, and that their fortunes are not looking up despite any ceasefire. Next, we must turn to the fact that the Syrian government is not want to allow in much needed resources into the country. As noted by Al Jazeera on the 5th of December 2016, the Syrian government has been extremely suspicious of outside aid organizations coming in and delivering resources, be it food or medical aid, into the country. The article notes that this is in large part due to the fact that these organizations are from areas that the Syrian government blames for instituting the war in the first place. Institutions that are bringing in medical aid in large part come from Western nations or Gulf nations, which back respectively the Free Syrian Army or moderate Sunni rebel groups affiliated with Al-Qaeda. Institutions bringing in food aid, meanwhile, come from these same nations. The government of Bashar al-Assad blames these governments for starting the rebellion in the first place with the protests of the Arab Spring in 2011, and thus blames these institutions for funding the rebellion. The Economist of the 21st of January 2017 thus notes that any further aid from these institutions is prohibited by the Syrian government and will continue to be prohibited despite any ceasefire. Thus, the Syrian people who need food and medicine will continue to need it, despite any ceasefire, because their government will not allow them to have it. And finally, we must look to the fact that the ceasefire does not actually stop the fighting in many areas of the country. The French newspaper Le Monde, on the 20th of January this year, notes that the ceasefire applies to all groups fighting on the ground, aside from those that the Russian, Turkish, and Syrian governments consider terrorist groups, which on the face of it seems like a good policy, except when you look at those groups which are considered terroristic by these three nations. The Syrian government considers many of the groups in opposition to it terrorists. Meanwhile, the government of Turkey considers many Kurdish groups, which it has been fighting a war against for the better part of 20 years, terrorists itself. The Russian government considers many al-Qaeda affiliates, due to the war in Chechnya, terrorists. All of this compounds upon itself to create a reality which CNN calls untenable in terms of a ceasefire. As according to a CNN article from the 15th of January 2017, the ceasefire is in reality a farce, meaning that the three nations involved are in actuality just teaming up to fight against their combined opponents, meaning the real losers on the ground are simply the Syrian people. And so today, we have examined the question, will the recent ceasefire on the ground in Syria actually lead to peace? And as we have seen, by looking to the fact that war crimes will not be holden, the Syrian people will not receive the aid they need, and the fact that many groups are not actually party to the ceasefire, the recent trilateral ceasefire in Syria will not actually lead to peace on the ground. And unfortunately, the Syrian people will have to suffer more in years to come.